Lately, there seems to be a bit of a debate on whether the Premier League is still the most competitive league in the world, the pinnacle of football, or whether it is slowly losing ground against its counterpart. The league in question that is being pitted against this mighty giant of world football is the Serie A, the top league from Italy, home to hundreds of incredible talents and place where thousands of talents saw their birth. Notoriously, the Italian league went through a golden age in the 90s. At that time, it was the best in the world. Every top talent wanted to play in Serie A. Following the birth of the Prem in 93, slowly it has seen a bit of a decline. They couldn't keep up with the money the Premier League could offer. Now, it is seeing a small resurgence. In the last 5 seasons in Italy, there have been 4 different winners of the acclaimed Scudetto, the famed title. Inter taking 2 successes with Napoli, Milan and Juventus, each adding 1 to their name. By contrast, the last 5 years in England, the title has been won by 2 teams. Liverpool lifting the trophy once, and Manchester City growing accustomed to it, winning 4 times. If you go even further back, the last time that City did not win the title was in 2016-17, when Chelsea triumphed under Antonio Conte. So if Liverpool hadn't gone on that epic season in 2019-20, we could have had a 7-year streak of them winning the Prem. Of course, one must not forget that the Serie A are also well warmed up with a team dominating, since they had Juventus going absolutely ballistic in the early 2010s, winning 9 consecutive Scudettos. Today, as this title suggests, we are here to answer a question. Has the Serie A become more competitive than the Premier League? One of the few things we'll go on to analyze is the winning margins in the league. This is not a decisive factor, but still, it's one way to determine and break up some of it. We'll grab the margins from the last 5 years and get an average out from them. In the 2019-20 season, the title in Italy was decided by 1 point, with Juventus just managing to triumph over Inter. If they did lose their last 2 games, but they had a good enough advantage to preserve and maintain their league win. In the Prem, Liverpool asserted their dominance, winning with an 18-point margin on second place Manchester City. So our first one is a landslide win from the Serie A. The following year, things would go in a more linear fashion, both titles decided well before the final game of the season. Inter stopping Juventus from getting their 10th title on the bounce, and Manchester City putting themselves back on the top of the table. Coincidentally, both teams won with a 12-point advantage. So a draw in the second year. For the 2021-22 season, we'll find one of the tightest gap yet. Milan returning to the top after 11 years, narrowly getting the better of eternal rivals Inter. The difference was 2 points, with the Rossoneri winning all of their last 5 games. Same cannot be said for the Nerazzurri, who only managed 4 wins out of 5. In the Prem, we would have a scare from Aston Villa, as after the first half of the final game of the season, City would be losing 2-0, but this would not be enough to faze the champions, with Super Ilkay Gundogan coming to the rescue, managing a 3-2 comeback against the villains, clinching the title by 1 point, making City back-to-back champions against Liverpool. Small side note, I feel like Liverpool lost the game by not scoring earlier, allowing City to be a bit more easy and not having to force the game in any way. They could have just played the game out and slowly made a comeback, without having to be under pressure. The first goal Liverpool scored was in the 80th minute, and at this point, City had already caught Aston Villa and were guaranteed to win the title, whatever happened in the game at the Molineux. The 2022-23 season, the field would tighten up in England, with a 2-way fight up till April between City and Arsenal, but the Gunners would struggle to maintain the form, losing 2 of the last 3 games, meaning that they dropped to 5 points from winners of Man City. In Serie A, a dominant display from Napoli, with Spalletti guiding the team from Naples to a 16-point advantage on second place Lazio, absolutely outplaying the whole league. Incredible display from Napoli that year. The Premier League last season would again see it come down to the wire, 2 points separating City and Arsenal. Again, very tight margins. While in Italy, Inter made it 2 titles in 5 seasons with a landslide win, obliterating the opposition, 19 points in front of rivals Milan. So with all that being said, let's crunch the numbers and see what comes out. The gap from the 5 years averaging everything out for the Serie A was 10 points, with the closest being that 1 point difference in the 2019-20 season. While in the Premier League, it came out as a 7.6, the closest being the 1 point gap in 2021-22. So the first smash goes to the Premier League. Closer gaps means more exciting battles at the top, with 2 to 3 teams sharing blows. Also, the gap tightened up in the last few years, with single-digit points keeping them apart. While in Serie A, even if there have been different winners, but one cannot chalk these out to one-season wonders. as in 3 out of the 5 years the league was won by more than 10 points, so decided well before the end of the season. For our second category, unfortunately for my friends that don't like math, we again have a numbers category. Average points required to get into the CL. Now I must remind everyone that unlike some countries, both the English league and the Italian one have 20 teams, so there is no differential in the games played during the year. I'll just make a small exception for the 2023-24 season because that year Italy had 5 teams qualify for the CL instead of 4. So I'll still count the 4th placement, that being Atalanta instead of Bologna. In the 2019-20 season, Lazio got access to the Champions League with a 78 points total. The following year, the bar to get into the CL remained untouched. Again 78 points with Juve taking the final spot. In 2022, it will come down slightly. 70 points would be enough to guarantee a spot in one of the biggest competitions in the world, with Juve again taking the final spot. Funnily enough, the following year, again the necessary points would remain unchanged as Milan would book a place with 70 points once more. In 2024, Serie A obtained an additional spot for CL qualifications, but we will still take the points gathered from the 4th place finish, which was Atalanta, who would claim the position with a respectable 69 points. So the total rounds out at 365, divide that by 5, which is the number of years, and we have that the average points needed to qualify for the Champions League is 73. Now, let's see how the Premier League fares against this. In 2019-20, Chelsea took the final spot with 66 points. They did the same in the 2021 season, but this time they needed 67 points. After the following year, Tottenham would make a return to the CL rounds, needing 71 points to be able to do so. The year after, it would be Newcastle's turn to enter the tournament with the same amount of points as Tottenham, and finally for the 2023-24 season, we would see a surprise new entry, Aston Villa booking their place with 68 points. All this will come out to 343, divide that by 5, and we find ourselves with a 68.6, a few points off from the Italian League 73. So we can say that it is riskier to drop games in Italy rather than England. Why is that? Well, my personal take on this is that in the Serie A there is a big divide between teams. The first 8 and the remaining 12 have huge differences, with enormous gaps in payrolls and facilities. With the exception of Bologna this year, the European spots are always distributed between the same teams. They are called the Seven Sisters, Le Sette Sorelle: Roma, Juventus, Inter, Atalanta, Milan, Napoli and Lazio. The difference between them is big. In the last few years the gap has started shrinking, but these 7 teams are still at the top by quite a bit. Every season there's at least a gap by 10 points between the top 7 or 8 with the rest of the league. This has happened once or twice in the Prem as well, but for the rest it's pretty tight, with 6 points closing out almost the whole mid-table more often than not. In the Italian league there's just a bigger difference in teams' skill levels, and this is also reflected in their spending. In the Serie A this season, only the first 8 teams spent over 50 million euros in the transfer window. These are all clubs who qualified for European spots, with the lower side of this special leaderboard not even managing to go over 10 million. In the Prem, only 2 clubs did not break the barrier of the 50 million spent, and not just any clubs. Liverpool and Manchester City, who both have well over the cash flow necessary. Ipswich Town, who were just promoted, spent 126 million on the market. To put this into perspective, they spent as much as Empoli, Monza, Lecce, Hellas Verona, Cagliari, Venezia, Udinese, Torino and Parma combined. One newly promoted team spent as much as 9 clubs in the Serie A, with 3 of them being established teams of the league. That's insane. Also, another situation is the TV rights that are distributed. I think I once read an article saying that the team that finishes last in the Prem gets as much in TV rights as the winner of the Serie A. That's mad, so it means that every team below the champions get less than the team that finishes in the bottom of the Prem, and TV deals are no small part in a team's financial growth. A lot of clubs count on these TV deals to be able to give them a bit more budget and a bit more payroll in the transfer window. Okay, so I pitted them against each other and all, but in terms of European football, how are we at? We can find some much deserved glory for both Italian and English sides, both of them having won the Conference League, with Roma getting it the first year and West Ham in the second, beating Fiorentina, an Italian team. However, we can find that if we look at teams that made it in the top 4 best teams of the Champions League, the Italians brought 2 teams into the semis in 2022-23 against England's 1. But the English were well represented in the previous editions, with 2 teams making semis against Italy's 0. And in the 2020-21 season, we can find that not only did English teams make it to the final, but it was actually a lockout from them, with Manchester City and Chelsea both playing the Champions League final. So, in conclusion, do I think the Serie A is overtaking the Prem? No, simply because in Italy, this huge gap that exists between the top 8 teams against the rest of the league makes it impossible for the Serie A to grow as a whole, whereas in England, we find most of the league performing well. It's very level, and you can believe that each year there might be a surprise team that might make it into the top. Teams like Aston Villa and Newcastle have proven this. Granted, Newcastle was endorsed by Saudi, but there isn't one part that runs away each year, leaving the others in the dust. Also, there isn't really such a big disparity in the money spent, with newly promoted teams like Ipswich spending €100 million on the market. This on one side makes it kind of ridiculous, the amount of money circulating in football in England. Like, how on earth can a team that just got promoted spend as much as Tottenham and Aston Villa? But on the other hand, it levels out the playing field and doesn't force a monopoly by bigger clubs. This makes all the Premier League teams feasible destination for players. Unlike in Italy, where 99% of the time, if a transfer is between, let's say, Parma and Juventus, you know who is getting picked. So I think the Serie A is not at a level as a league in a whole, where they could say, oh yes, we're better than the English. Some teams are better than them on paper, but I put 20 Premier League teams against 20 Italian teams. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends with a major victory for the Premier League. The Italian Federation should work on growing the whole league evenly, instead of constantly giving more power to the same clubs. That way, in the future, we can see the Italians catch up and potentially even overtake the Prem.